me go ahead and introduce our final presenter this morning, and who will be with us also this afternoon. So Dr. Jenet Jacob Erickson is an affiliated scholar with the Wheatley Institution, so she's one of ours, and we claim her proudly. She's a former assistant professor in the School of Family Life here at Brigham Young University. Her research specializes in maternal and child well-being and has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report, Slate Magazine, and the Today Show. She's authored over 20 scientific articles and book chapters and presented numerous times at national and international conferences. In 2004, she was selected as a social science research fellow for the Heritage Foundation, where she completed research analysis on non-maternal care for policymakers. Dr. Erickson received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Brigham Young University and her PhD from the highly prestigious, one-of-a-kind Family Social Science program at the University of Minnesota, which happens to be my institution as well. So only the best of the best come from Minnesota, right? She is currently a columnist on family issues for the Deseret News National Edition, and she and her husband enjoy their family life journey with 2 young children. So, Jenet Erickson.
It's wonderful to be here and to hear Erica and to hear Sharif again by video was so wonderful. And Jason and I know a lot about cold from being in Minnesota, so this is right at home. I've been thinking about what a privilege, and I'm sure you feel this, but what a privilege it is to learn in this setting about these issues that are so meaningful. As a graduate student, I got this email from the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. This was before BYU had events like this, and I was at the University of Minnesota, and they said, you are invited to come to a gathering with other potential scholars, the Witherspoon Institute, and that was a transformative experience. There's something about being in a close group. I think there were 20 of us total. Joe Price, Professor Price was there as a graduate student, and Catherine Pekalik, who's a wonderful scholar, is a graduate student, and Jeremy Ucker, who does great research on sexuality and adolescence, he was there too. And to be with them was so wonderful because none of us knew what would become of us entirely, right? But it was remarkable to be in the presence of Brad Wilcox, Maggie Gallagher, Sarah McClanahan, the great scholars of our day. And so I hope you'll just feel what a gift it is that you can be thinking about day in, day out while you're here and learning from people who you will become, right? You will become. So I'm so honored to be here and to have the opportunity to interact with you. I today get to talk about something I've never talked about before publicly. And usually when I present at this conference, I get to talk about what we do for children, how family structure impacts children, what mothers and fathers do that's unique and distinct, and why we're really significant in the lives of children. And today the focus is going to be a little bit different, the inverse. In 1947, Carl Zimmerman, Harvard's sociology professor and arguably the most important American sociologist of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, wrote his magnum opus, Family and Civilization, an analysis of the role of the family as great civilizations rose and fell. Greece, Rome, the European empires, and ultimately our own modern era. To guide his analysis, Zimmerman focused on one question. That's a copy of his book, and it's neat that Alan Carlson, who is here, wrote the foreword for this edition. So you're right with the people who understand this really deeply. Of the total power in society, this was his focus as he looked at all of these periods of time and great civilizations. How much power belongs to the family? Of the total amount of control in a society, how much is left for the family? What role does the family play in the total business of society? If we want to marry or break up a family, who do we consult? The family, the church, or the state? If we are in need, to whom do we go? The family or the community? If we violate a rule, who punishes us? The family or the state? Now, if you're like me, it's hard to think of anything than our reality right now. But imagine a structure where you have the trustee family, which is where the extended family, the clan, is the ruling power in society. And so individuals are punished, their transgressions, their actions are controlled by the clan, Or imagine the next, where there's a balance that way. And we'll come back to the domestic family, but there's a balance of power between the family and what kind of punishments take place and who has control, and the institutions like government and the church. Now imagine the atomistic family, in which the individual is given primary focus, responsibility, the legal and social power, while the family has virtually no power or field of action. And I'll get to a question that you might ask if you're in the trustee family, or in this atomistic family. Now, as he observed, societies shifted from being driven by the trustee family, where that was the source of power, to a domestic family, and finally to the atomistic family, where the individual was the ruling authority. And Bill Doherty says this in his book, Intentional Family. When you move to this form of family, the psychological family, he calls it, this atomistic family, the question is not, what can I do to create or sustain or do for my family? It is, what does marriage and children do for me, right? That's today, right? Why do I get married? Because of what it does for me, because I found my love. And why do we have children? Because it's great to have these beings, right, that we can invest in and are evidence of us. So it's about me. Now, interesting that Zimmerman makes this interesting comment. He found that, for example, the trustee family type of the Roman Empire replaced the weak empire of the atomistic Greek family. The strong trustee families of the barbarian tribes replaced the weak atomistic Roman families. And the pattern continued into the rise and fall of the European empires, and he would say into our modern era. Because society cannot last very long on the atomistic family. Something has to be done to remedy that. Why? Look at his quote. As the family type shifted from the trustee family to the domestic family and finally to atomistic family, he writes, the individual is left more and more alone to do as he wishes. At first, the freedom becomes an incentive to economic gain. But sooner or later, the meaning of this freedom changes. The individual, having no guiding moral principles, changes the meaning of freedom from opportunity to license. Having no internal or external guides to discipline him, he becomes a gambler with life, always seeking greener pastures. When he comes to inevitable difficulty, he is alone in his misery. He wishes to pass his difficulties and his misery on to others. Consequently, he continually helps build up institutions to remedy his misery. What you can see is that society cannot last long on the individual atomistic model, which is what he saw across time. So, interestingly enough, it was the domestic family that was found in all civilizations at their peak of creativity and progress. Because this domestic family allowed for natural desires for freedom, movement, some individual autonomy, while preserving the social structure, the family structure that alone can nurture the attachments basic to human society, upon which civilization depends. It retained what Zimmerman calls familism, the social system crucial to bringing forth the next generation. And this is why I quote him, because we come to the crux of what defines the best societies, right? And what it is that allows this familism. And this is what he says. It is all about the orienting of the family and society to who? Children. How does that society, how do families orient themselves toward children? That's what determines if society is at its peak of creativity and progress. Now think of that being so ironic, given our belief, right, that it's about me and these children as baggage to the development of my creativity and my progress. Okay. So we know a great deal about what we do for children. We know quite a bit. In fact, I love how this few propositions have more empirical support in the social sciences than this one. Compared to all other family forms, families headed by married biological parents are best for children. It's a law, as law-like as you can get in the social sciences. We know a lot about that. We also know a lot about how the family structure in which a child is born and reared either ensures them that they will have a life, a trajectory that is healthy and happy, or it will not. We know how nurturing impacts their life trajectory, and we know quite a bit more than we have in the past about what mothers and fathers do differently and why it's beneficial to have a father, just as Erica just talked about, what unique contributions fathers and mothers make. We know much less, we talk much less about what children do for us. What do they do for us? And that is what I get to talk to you about today. You're surrounded by messages, for example, that when having it all, this is New York Times headline, when having it all means not having children. Or studies repeatedly quoted as saying people are better off without having children. Children are more expensive than ever. Have you heard that line, right? Marital satisfaction decreases after having children. In fact, the underlying theme of our culture, as spoken really eloquently by Robert Bella and his colleagues out of Berkeley, is that to become one's own person, that's our goal, to become one's own person, almost, and this beautiful, poignant language, almost to give birth to oneself. That is our purpose. Think of that difference. So I'm going to divide Ryan Anderson, and I've been so helped by wonderful people here. Jonathan Pike's been such a big help. He's right in the back. But Ryan Anderson distinguishes the value of marriage between its utilitarian benefits, or what we might call up here its instrumental benefits, right? What it does that we can measure, and its intrinsic value, that which marriage is its own good. It is a good in and of itself. I'm going to do the same thing when we talk about children. So we'll start with what are sort of the instrumental, why might we say it's good for us to have children because of these benefits that they give us extrinsically? You might imagine the first one of this instrumental value is we need human capital to survive as a society, just as Dr. Carlson spoke of last night. For 2 centuries, overpopulation has haunted the imagination of the modern world. According to Thomas Malthus, writing in 1798, a contemporary of Adam Smith actually, human population growth would always surpass agricultural production, which means a gigantic inevitable famine would eventually level the population of the earth if we did not stop and curb our population growth. You probably grew up hearing a little bit, probably some allusions to the 1970s Paul Ehrlich piece called The Population Bomb, his book. He concluded hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death if we do not curb population growth. Now, at the time, as Dr. Carlson shared, coming out of the World War II, there was an increase in the number of children people were having. But we also had this population explosion because so many fewer children were dying in childhood and people were living longer, right? So science has made possible a much bigger population than had been possible before. This caused utter fear, right? Because we're just growing and we're going to double and double and double until there's nothing. Well, at the time when he was writing this, and this is according to authors of that time, the American replacement rate was already below 2.13. And the fertility crisis was already a reality in nation after nation. As Jonathan Last explains in What to Expect When No One's Expecting, all first world countries today are already before the 2.1 line. And the rates of decline among third world countries, which is important because we say, well, we'll just immigrate, right? We'll just bring in immigrants to refill our population. But they are dropping themselves in steeper declines than in the first world. Mexico, for example, is in an unprecedented dramatic decline in population. Japan and Italy, for example, have a 1.4 total fertility rate, a mathematical tipping point at which the population will decline by 50% in 45 years. As for the rest of Europe, by 2050, only 3 countries in the EU, France, Luxembourg, and Ireland, which have an average rate of 1.5, will not be experiencing population declines. And immigration cannot provide the solution because Latin American countries will likely have a fertility rate lower than that of the United States at that time. But modern economies depend on human capital, and human capital is made up of 2 things: people and their capacities for production. So for modern high-tech economies based on consumers who buy, entrepreneurs who create wealth and jobs, and workers with taxes that fund social welfare entitlements, people are the critical resource. With fewer and fewer workers, each has to become more productive in order to keep the economy from shrinking. But ironically, we are less educated than the generation before us. Now, is that interesting? So we think, well, we're just going to get everybody better trained, right? And they'll produce more, they'll be higher quality. But educational levels are declining. Men in particular are struggling. And so here's some implications. As the ratio of workers to retirees declines sharply beginning in 2030, there will be 2 workers per retiree. By 2050, part of the world will have significantly higher percentage of aging people than young people. And that means that the most innovative group, that 30 to 44 age group, ages 30 to 44, is declining dramatically. So who will be the innovators, right? The impact on economic growth, savings, investment, consumption, labor markets, pensions, taxation, intergenerational transfers, housing demand, medical care that's unsustainable, even in the most wealthy nations, to say nothing, as Jonathan Lass speaks of, the disorder considering nations like China or Russia, a declining superpower with rapidly contracting economic base and an unstable political structure. If low birth rates are combined with increased longevity, which is what we have, if fewer people die before maturity, we have what Sorokin would call a disastrous situation with economic, technological, artistic, and military vitality of the society involved. He writes very prophetically. Now, Sorokin is someone you need to study. Wow, thank you, Jonathan. His life is so remarkable. He was the founder of Harvard's sociology department and was part of the Bolshevik Revolution as a young man, comes from Russia, grew up abandoned by an alcoholic father at a certain age, and he and his brother were glassmakers in churches in Western Russia. And you just watch this man who grew up learning by real life experience, then become a brilliant scholar and start Harvard's program, then write what he had learned. Listen to this powerful statement. Whatever may be the virtues of age, they cannot compensate for the vitality, vigor, courage, daring, elasticity, and creativity of the young. A nation largely composed of middle-aged or elderly people enfeebles itself physically, mentally, and socially, and moves toward the end of its creative mission and leadership. But the truth is, there is very little discussion anywhere in public elite settings about this population crisis. You might, as scholars, have to hammer on it over and over and over again to say, we need children, or we cannot survive. Most often the reaction is, well, either immigrants will come in, and Dr. Carlson, I want to ask you that question. I thought someone asked last night, what do people respond to this? Well, they just don't respond. It's like well, we'll just see what happens. We'll do whatever it takes. But a real thing, we depend, quite literally, on the well-being of children and their existence to survive. The second piece, what do children do for our orientation as a society toward marriage and sexuality? And I hope that Erica's wonderful message has already made you think about that. It is through children that sexual relations become of importance. If children were not the fruit of sexual relations, nobody would care about them or what people did with them. Across millennia, the reality of children has oriented societies toward marriage because marriage recognizes that humanity is male and female who reproduce sexually and give birth to helpless, socially needy offspring who remain immature for long periods of time and depend on the love and support of both of the parents who brought them into existence. Marriage attempts to sustain enduring bonds between women and men in order to give a baby its mother and father. In the words of Monty Stewart, who wrote about this in Harvard Law Review, it situates heterosexual passion within a social institution that will, to the largest practical extent, assure that the consequences of procreative passion, namely children, begin and continue life with adequate private welfare. We argue today With marriage on the outs, Isabel Sahil will say, there's no restoring marriage. It's gone. It's a gone institution. So we've got to find a way to make a child-centered culture without marriage. Wow. Brad Wilcox really powerfully says, no other institution reliably connects two parents and their money, talent, and time to their children in the way that marriage does. We have found no replacement for it. We will not find a replacement for it. Having children also means that there's a dramatic decline in the likelihood of divorce, and it's always been that way. You know, people who have kids, what do they decide to do when times get tough? They work to stay together, right? Children mean less divorce. And with that, society is the best beneficiary. All of us benefit when marriage is held up and in place. Millions of Americans enjoy a significant incremental increase in happiness, health, and productivity when marriage is strong. Now, think about this other wonderful piece. For all, especially of the lower socioeconomic levels, marriage has to do with well-being and increased levels of well-being. Recent data indicates that children, of course, who are born to married parents as opposed to unmarried parents, their likelihood of climbing out of poverty is dramatically increased. Dramatically. So even if they're born to poor parents, their likelihood of doing better is dramatically increased. But what's also wonderful is even if they don't have married parents, growing up in an environment with married families means their chances of getting out of poverty are much higher. So even if your own parents are not married, if you're surrounded by a marriage culture, your chances of coming out of poverty are much higher. Because you're given an image of what to do to have a life that's better and the people all around you. Think of what it means, what children mean to our orientation around sexuality. And that should, just as she was talking about in the last lecture, this should really be right here at the front of your minds. What does sex mean for children? Again, Sorokin provides a very, very strong statement. And these aren't his words, these are mine. A sexually permissive culture is anathema to children. It is anathema to children. Sorokin writes in 1956, almost prophetically, one might think that a culture that encourages early sexual experimentation, premarital and extramarital sexual relationships, casual sex, multiple lifetime partners, and many other features of a sex-liberated society. This was in 1956. This is before what we mark as the sexual revolution, but he was already witnessing it. He says, you would think that this society would produce more babies and have a higher birth rate than a sexually more restrained or sexually repressed society. Communities whose members become preoccupied with the hunt for sexual excitement and sexual pleasure usually do not want to be burdened by the obligations of raising children whose care presents great obstacles to the realization of these goals. Whether through abortion, infanticide, contraception, or the involuntary sterility that sometimes results from venereal disease, the birth rates in such societies will dramatically decline. Sexual permissiveness is anathema to children because it restricts people from pursuing those goals. What about the role of children in our public policies? This is really interesting to think about because it can go both directions. Their inherent vulnerability, children's, means that everybody in the political world grabs onto children as their reason for a particular public policy. Even the abortionists, right? This is for the well-being of who? Children. We're going to ensure quality of life, not just their existence, but the quality of their existence. And so we are pro-abortion for the sake of children. What I think is interesting is that children really are at the core, very often, of arguments about public policies. Now, as Dr. Carlson shared, that might mean two different answers. They might say, we're pro-children, and so we're pro-welfare programs, right? Government welfare programs, because we believe children need to be cared for by somebody. Or it could mean we're pro-children, and so we know the institution that far surpasses anything else in providing for them is marriage, a marriage culture. Think about alcohol establishments. Think about policies having to do with welfare. Think about what happens with how we do movie ratings. Think about sexually explicit content being available in settings, libraries, where children might be. children become a really important source of guiding social policies. Their presence, zoning laws. Salt Lake had a big change in alcohol ordinance laws and locally, and what came up is, what does this mean for children? Can these be by schools? Can they be in the presence where children would be walking by them? New alcohol establishments. The crux of it was, what does this mean for children? Their presence orients us to the future and to Sarah Ruddick, feminist scholar Sarah Ruddick's language of attentiveness. She describes maternal thought with its interest in preserving the lives of children, fostering their growth, and shaping them to be acceptable and useful, and adds this plea that maternal thought be brought into the public realm to make the preservation and growth of all children a work of public conscience and legislation. Now, interesting, people who have children, married and have children, are more politically conservative. They're also more religious, and we'll get to that. So they tend to be more politically conservative and religious. Now, the question is, do they become more politically conservative because they have children? Or were they conservative and that's why they married and have children? Both are true. It appears that people become more conservative in their beliefs socially about social policy once they've had children, and the experience of having children. Once they see how much this child depends on the father and the mother, all of a sudden they're like, maybe there's something to this marriage idea, right? Children, that experience of it shapes them. What about in our orientation toward religiosity? The demographic group that is most likely to be going to church are married parents with children. And we know some that family formation, this end one, family formation shapes religiosity, meaning when parents become parents, they're more likely to go back to church. Have you known people like that? Right? They have a baby, and all of a sudden they're thinking a lot more about how they want this child raised. And so it means they're interested in coming back to church. And we have some evidence for that, especially if they've been active as adolescents in religion. They've known it to provide answers. They knew what it meant to them. And even though they left church, when they have children, they think, I want to go back to that with my children. And that is accompanied with all kinds of benefits. So you've been able to see some of these extrinsic, these utilitarian benefits that children mean to society. And now we move to what the instrumental value is for individuals. What do children mean for individuals? Well, guess what? Men who marry, and I'm gonna highlight this distinction between marry and having children, but usually they're tied together, experience this marriage premium. They work harder, they're smarter, they're more successful. In fact, they average a $16,000 more per year income than their single peers. They have an increased earning power between 10 to 24%, and a man who stays married across his life into his 50s has 3 times the assets of a peer who does not. 3 times. They're also more emotionally satisfied with intimacy, and they have an average of 10 years longer lifespan from having been married. Now, Erica talked about this second thing. Fathers have lower levels of testosterone than their childless peers, which is associated with benefits, including more responsive parenting. Even before the infant is born, fathers show increased hormone levels that parallel the mother's in pregnancy. If he's living with her, it's like his body is experiencing at least some of the effects that she is also experiencing in terms of becoming attuned to nurturing. And more biological changes are experienced as they actively care for those children. Experienced fathers like mothers, and these are animal studies, rat studies, demonstrate enhanced boldness, food-finding abilities, and problem-solving. They are also more attentive to their mate and to their family, and less vulnerable to distractions, like our good friend who was video gaming his heart out, right? And meets, this is after they've had she's expecting their first child. He meets some of the people that he's video gaming with that had cool names like Charger, or I don't know, just, really exciting name. He meets them and he thinks, I'm hanging out with these geeks, right? Really? I think I'm gonna go back to my wife and their baby. And what happened when she had that baby is it shifted his orientation. He was less distracted and more directed to her well-being and that baby's. Now, what about women? Women also experience biological impacts. For a long time, you've heard about the pregnancy brain, right? women lose their brains, each baby, the brain dies further and further, right? Which cannot explain my mother with 11, who's a genius. But the truth is, we know from rat studies that what happens is that mother is experiencing a whole lot of wiring and complexity of mapping that actually increases her capacities. So look at this. Mother rats with the most mothering experience learned most efficiently and retained their knowledge longest. These multitasking mothers had to prioritize tasks, tune out distractions, solve problems, make decisions, change strategies when circumstances required. And they just showed a boost, both because of the biological changes that are happening hormonally and the experience of having to do that as a mother. In both cases, mothers and fathers, they benefit. Sorokin calls this the marriage family school. And I can just tell you, I had a PhD before having children. I knew nothing. I knew nothing. I feel like I've been in the most intense graduate program I could design for anyone. Day in, day out learning. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but I love Sorokin's language, the marriage family school. He says, the cultivation of love and task of educating children stimulate married persons to release and develop their best creative impulses. For surely the mission of molding their own and their children's personalities is as ennobling as the creation of a masterpiece of art in the arts or sciences. And regardless of education, this can happen for people at all levels. So he would say, marriage is the most universal and the most democratic school for the development of the creative potential of every human being. Now, I will never, that's a pretty profound statement, right? That's for everybody. Whatever your educational level, you grow from being married and having children in profound ways. I was sitting in the Marriott Center at BYU when I heard Elder Robert D. Hales say this, and I think it's one of the most profound statements on the marriage family school that I know of. He was giving a lecture, a presentation about lifelong learning. He said, motherhood is the ideal opportunity for lifelong learning. A mother's learning grows as she nurtures the child in his or her development years. They are both learning and maturing together at a remarkable pace, and I can attest to that. It is exponential, not linear. Just think of the learning process of a mother throughout the lifetime of her children. Each child brings an added dimension to her learning because their needs are so varied and far-reaching. For example, in the process of rearing her children, a mother studies such topics as child development, nutrition, healthcare, physiology, psychology, nursing with medical research and care, and educational tutoring in many diverse fields such as math, science, geography, literature, English, and foreign languages. She develops gifts such as music, athletics, dance, and public speaking. The learning examples could continue endlessly. And he adds, just think of the spiritual learning that is required as a mother teaches her children spiritual principles, gospel principles. You understand the gospel entirely differently when you're trying to teach it to your own children at a level you didn't know you could possibly get to. Now, when we think about people rotting as mothers, right? I hope you'll remember this, that it is a new form of schooling. It's very applied, and it's very rigorous, and it invites all dimensions of capacity to be expanded. Now, we see evidence of this. These are pretty powerful statements. I'll never forget first reading Kathy Eden's Promises I Can Keep. She's an ethnographer, brilliant ethnographer, wanted to understand why are low-income women still having children outside of marriage with wide access to contraception. They are surrounded by places where they could access it. They have full access to abortion. Why are they still having children out of wedlock? Now, it's interesting, at the end of her book, she describes a meeting with all of these white female scholars discussing her findings in a room. One of the women was pregnant. Amidst that group of women, there were repeated comments about this ruins their chances for education, it ruins what happens with their life trajectory, it puts them into poverty, it's horrible. And this woman had listened for long enough, and she stood up with her belly and said, why is it so hard to imagine that someone would want a child? And then they looked more closely at what these women said about having children. You can look at some of these here. My kids have matured me a lot. These are these interviews with low-income mothers. If I hadn't them and gone to college, I probably would have gotten lost because of drugs and stuff. I'd have no direction if I hadn't had a child. There was no point to live for other than the next day getting high. Now I feel like I have a beautiful little girl. I'm excited when I get up in the morning. I'm complete. I've done what I was supposed to do. My son gives me the love that I need. A lot of people say young girls have babies for money from welfare. It's not for that. It's not even to keep the guy. It's just to have somebody to take care of, to love. No, I didn't use birth control because I wanted a baby. I needed something to fill up that hole. It gave them, and you're going to hear both healthy and unhealthy responses, right, to that question. All of them are important. It gave them connection, a place in the world, a purpose to give their life for, the possibility of validation, purpose, connection, and order that they could not have in the world as they knew it. Now, this leads us to a very important concept, that the ordering of marriage and parenthood is really critical, because what do you think the chances are for most of these children? As much as it has helped that mother, what are the chances for these children? They are at least 3 times, research shows, more likely to struggle in every possible domain of life, coming from an unmarried, low-income mother. Which tells us why this ordering of marriage and parenthood is so important, which is what children should do for us. Marriage and children means, and I want you to see the ordering here, the momentous transformation of a boy into a husband-father. Now, I think it's really interesting that when you see these Kathy Eden statements from women, do you see men in those statements about their children doing that for them? Low-income, unmarried dads? No. They're still on the streets doing drugs, showing up once a year to give diapers. Why? Because men's development is oriented toward mate selection. It is oriented towards marriage. They grow in preparing to become marriageable. That's when men grow. And of course, they grow in the process of providing and caring for it. Just as Erica showed, it plays out so clearly. His link to his children is through their mother. Not only through their mother, but that's a very significant dimension of his relationship to them. It's why when parents get divorced, who are they much less likely to see? Their dad. Why does he quit calling them? He calls them on their birthdays or visits them, every weekend, and we've gotten better with this. But early on with the rates of divorce, dads just slowly dropped entirely out of the picture, and it became very clear that unless he is living with and caring with the mother of those children, that relationship is severed in powerful ways. The same thing shows up in terms of their development to become marriageable is really important for who they are. It shapes a boy into a husband, father, and a girl into a wife, mother, with corresponding changes in their social position, privileges, and responsibilities. A change accepted socially, civilly, theologically, legally, and so forth. Marriage is the evidence of the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and civic maturity of the individual, right? He is well enough to developed that somebody would want to marry him, right? She is such that he would want to marry her. And sexual relations within marriage become the acceptance of the responsibilities and privileges of marriage itself as ordered to the creation of children. So hopefully, right, we can restore this appreciation for marriage that, Mark Regnerus just published a book called Cheap Sex, illustrating just what Erica talked about, what the wide availability of easy access to sex has done to men. Do they have to become marriageable people anymore? No, and they don't. So with women having children out of wedlock, what you have is this dynamic that's very difficult for children. Wow, okay. Children are a catalyst then for change. The central idea of our way of life is that its aim is self-fulfillment, the imperium of the self, an ideal of non-binding commitments, allowing us to pursue self-interest. Autonomy means protection from these intrusions of chance. In such a world, children are not a welcome responsibility, because to have children is plainly to cease being a child yourself. Michael Novak writes so powerfully about this, which is precisely why we so desperately need them. He candidly writes of marriage and fatherhood, this remarkable scholar and man. Most of what I'm forced to learn about myself is not pleasant as a husband and father. The sheer impenetrable selfishness in the human breast, in my breast, is a never source of wonderment. I do not want to be disturbed, challenged, or troubled. Huge regions of myself belong only to me. What raising children does for us is it brings us breathtaking vistas of our inadequacy. You just wait. More than any other experience in my life, this is revelatory of my selfishness and my inadequacy. Seeing myself, this is his powerful language, through the unblinking eyes of an intimate, intelligent other, an honest spouse, is humiliating beyond anticipation. A rational man acting as I, trying to keep my emotions, right, in check, trying to act fairly to children, each of whom is temperamentally different from myself and from each other, is far more baffling, he says, than anything Harvard prepared me for. Most of the lessons I learn are of difficulty and duress, lessons for which I cannot help but be grateful. And so he ends with these words, "My bonds to them hold me back from many opportunities. Yet they do not feel like bonds. They are, I know, my liberation. They force me to be a different sort of human being in a way in which I want and need to be forced." Now we get to the beautiful ending. Why? Because there is intrinsic, inherent goodness in children. First, children invite, by their very vulnerable natures, invite love, devotion, and sacrifice. That process saves us. Anthropologist Merlin Myers, who is a BYU professor, describes our morality of self-interest as ultimately alienating, for it encourages us to treat people as things and as relationships as opportunities for profit. Instead, he says, love is the basal principle of human social relationships, and love is defined as one's willingness to sacrifice for another. Myers was convinced that the experience of sacrificing for and receiving the sacrifices of others was the glue of society. That morality of kinship, the morality of love, devotion, and sacrifice that children invite, that willingness to not count the cost in sacrificing for one's own, is in stark contrast to the morality of the market, which is about contracts, exchange, and profit. It is the heart, then, of the moral development of any society. Children's moral development, as you see over and over again in accounts of those who end up shooting classmates, right? Moral development depends on the experience of receiving devotion and sacrifice. And not in every case do we see this, but often. Of the parents, their own biological parents, for each other and for them. They build upon that devotion when they choose to sacrifice and devote themselves to their own. Now, Sorokin writes powerfully of this also. He calls this the fountainhead, the love that parents show, the sacrifice, the commitment, the devotion that parents show for children. He calls it the fountainhead of human solidarity, and says this: the increasing number of childless couples, insofar as their childlessness is voluntary, and the growing number of desertions of children by their parents are symptoms of a progressive decline of parental instinct, of parental attachment, love, and care for offspring. If this fountainhead of unselfish care and spontaneous help is drying up, most of the forms of interhuman solidarity will also dry up. For among the causes of the endless conflicts of our time, the withering of parental love plays an important part. After all, charity or love does begin at home, at the cradle of the helpless baby. If there is no baby, no cradle, there can be no loving and caring parents, and no family school to teach children the basic ABCs of unselfish conduct toward their fellow men and the world at large. You see the power of children in terms of creating the glue, the moral glue that society depends on, our care for them doing that. Yet, children don't bring happiness. Over and over again, we see people are less happy after they have children, and they get happier when kids leave. Now, this science is a little bit nuanced, but it still shows up that marital satisfaction drops and then it increases after kids leave the nest. And so how do we make sense of the fact that people are still having children? Why? If supposing that our cultural norm about all of it is true, why are people still having children? Why do they even care to have children? Because children intrinsically bring meaning. And it's a meaning that we'll talk a little bit more here towards the end, but that can't be measured. Children are associated with meaning, a tremendous sense of meaning. Parents become happier than non-parents and show less decline in happiness over time. And most mothers and fathers rate parenting as their greatest joy, believing it outweighs the sacrifices of their romantic relationships and otherwise. Of course, happiness scholar Roy Baumeister finds that a better measure, actually, of well-being is what we call meaning, which has more to do with giving, effort, and sacrifice than it has to do with day-to-day feelings of pleasure. I love these beautiful statements. Mary Eberstadt quotes. She says this: "Take my answering the question of happiness seems to depend on which end of life's telescope one looks through. Take my 45-year-old friend with stage 4 cancer whose wife and 3 children have spent the last year rotating at his bedside, never leaving him alone. Do his family members make him miserable? They are the only things on earth that don't. Nothing puts children in perspective so much as mortality." Eberstadt continues by referencing a talented journalist named Marjorie Williams, very talented Washington Post writer, who was diagnosed with lethal cancer at a young age, relatively young age. In a now famous column written right before her death in 2012, who do you think she talks about? Her children. She poignantly describes watching her daughter dress for Halloween. That last column was, of course, about her children. As Eberstadt insightfully notes, to mothers and fathers who learn the hardest way of all that time really is as short as a birthday candle, family and children aren't everything. For most, they're the only thing. Why? Why such meaning? Wendell Berry uses these powerful words: "It is only in these bonds that our individuality has a use and a worth. It is only to the people who know us, love us, and depend on us, of which children are the ultimate expression, that we are indispensable as the persons we uniquely are. These bonds give love its only chance to mean, for only they can give it a history, a community, and a place." There's more to this beautiful story, and this is helped by Richard Williams' wonderful understanding of Emmanuel Levinas, that tells us in this beautiful procreative relationship, sexuality is neither knowledge nor power, but the plurality of our existing. I do not have my child. I am my child. Paternity is a relation with a stranger who, while being other, is me. A relation of the I with a self which yet is not me. In existing, there is a multiplicity and transcendence. In this transcendence, I am not swept away, since my son is not me, and yet I am my son. This other, the infinite end beyond ourselves, yet of ourselves, is its transcendence. Each person is not born from himself, does not make himself, does not have himself as his own destiny. Our filial form, the fact that we come into being through two individuals and God, right, the Spirit, tells us that to be is to be loved. We are loved into being. The body reminds us that our life is a life received. And so the unity of married love is more than a sharing of worldviews. The more one belongs to another, the more we belong to oneself. And I think if we think about the sanctity of the procreative process, where she is both, a woman and man are both, Catholics would describe it as wealthy and poor, right, in the same being. I am a whole being, but in receiving my husband, I offer my poverty, he his wealth, and I discover my wealth. There's this beautiful process of this relationship dynamic that happens where we offer the fullest gift of ourselves to one another and find our wholeness, right? The unity of married love is more than a sharing of worldviews. It is in being oneself in the other. The more that one belongs to another, the more that one belongs to oneself. That is revealed in the child. His identity, and this is so powerful, the child's identity abides in the place of love to which his parents have been entrusted. The parents' unity of love is the place in which the child with God is defined as a person. Their unity of love with God is how that child is defined as a person. Now, that would help us explain why children who experience divorce experience such challenges, okay? We've wondered why do even children who grow up with lots of resources and their parents remarry and they get access to all these things, why are they still struggling, right? What's the deal? It obviously isn't money and resources. Why do they seem broken inside? And I might just say my husband, his parents, like Erica's, they are not members of the church, divorced when he was 6. He's an only child. He went from one house to the other every week. And when I described to him these, he's always said this powerful statement to me. He said, as I became older, the thought that would happen to me is, if they were not meant to be, was I meant to be? That's what children describe, okay? Look at these quotes from Torn Asunder. The night when I learned of my mother's affair is the revelation when my family became undone. That night, in the span of minutes, my entire belief system was shattered. Trust was not lost only in other persons, but in the coherence of the world. I'll never forget a little boy, and his mother was a dear friend of mine, parents getting divorced, and he would tell everybody, he was probably 4, he would always say, we are getting divorced. You're not getting divorced. Your mom and dad are getting divorced. And he would what would come out of his mouth would say, we are getting divorced. Literally torn asunder. Helen Lind, we have become strangers in a world where we thought we were at home. We cannot trust our answers to the questions, who am I? Where do I belong? How can I be at all, now that the people who are responsible for my very being are no longer together? Loretta, Dad was saying things like, as he learned about his wife's infidelity, I never ever loved your mother. I don't know why I didn't get out of this sooner. And that was really painful, because it was like he was saying, I wish you'd never been born. That was the implication behind it. In both adoption and divorce, what we find in children is a longing deep within them to find what was, the love that was, to get in touch with the original intactness of their own being. What do children give to us? They bring home into being in this world. They are the source of home, the ontology of us being in this world. Through matrimony, the seed of the home is planted. That seed comes to life upon the birth of a child. No wonder then Christ describes them, right, as new life. What does he say to his apostles before he's going to be crucified? He says, weeping endureth through a night, but in the morning we rejoice because a man is born into the world. That is the best symbol he can give for the gift of the resurrection. A child, new life, eternal life is born into the world. Which gets me to, and I am so sorry to be slow here. I don't want you to miss any of this. It's so valuable, so I'm just going to proceed and try to end quickly. I love this beautiful insight about children and wonder. And let me tell you, it's what drives me crazy, too, as a mother, right? We are very often out of sync because children, most adults like me, depend on coherence, predictability, and clarity Children, by definition, are incoherent, unpredictable, and mostly mysterious, okay? And what's amazing is we often spend a lot of time trying to understand their world if we want to effectively be close to them. We call that, Seamus Carey calls it wonder. Their ability to be present, not to be future-oriented, like I continually am, to be present in the moment. When we choose not to neglect, ignore, or suppress the allure of wonder that is so natural to children, when we choose the openness that characterizes their conscious presence, we experience the needed antidote to our impulse to control. And as soon as you decide that, life is better. You can't control, right? This enables us to transcend the confines of our calculative mind and to experience the depths of another's world. That is what children and wonder do for us. I love the A.A. Milne. We have fallen in love with A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh's author. Genius. Cambridge University, studying mathematics, leaves the university so he can write, has a child, and his whole world is changed. This boy, Christopher Robin, becomes the source of his genius, right? And he would say he wrote the books not for children. Not those stories were not written for children, but for the child within each of us. On his tomb, he wanted a picture of Piglet and Pooh, and then one just of Piglet. He loved Piglet best, I think. And he said, so when St. Peter sees them on my tomb, he will let me in because I am their friend. He speaks to something powerful. Why do we resonate with that statement? Because there is a child within each of us. And the more that child, that wonder is nurtured, that health and well-being is nurtured, the better we will be at nurturing that in others. I end with what I think, I'll just end with this beautiful quote from the great mentor to C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald. He has this beautiful statement, brothers, have you found our King? And as you're reading this, think of the Savior's words, suffer the little children. And he took a child and set them in the midst of them. Whosoever receiveth one of these children in my name receiveth me. Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones, for I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father. So here's George MacDonald, this Savior that he loves, speaking of him. Brothers, have you found our King? There he is, kissing little children and saying they are like God, the God who never is and never needs to be in haste, who welcomes the simplest thoughts of truth or beauty as they return for seed he has known. The Lord of hosts, the God of mountains and oceans, the God of history working in time unto Christianity. This God is the God of little children. And he alone can be perfectly, abandonedly simple and devoted. I end with the insights that Jonathan Pike has been so inspiring in helping me understand. And it returns us to Zimmerman. Our LDS doctrine teaches us that the glory of God, his fullest expression of glory, is the continuation of the seeds. We are also told in the same section of the Doctrine and Covenants, except ye abide my law, ye cannot attain unto this glory. These scriptures add insight into Zimmerman's analysis, what he showed. Children are the result and highest manifestation of a person and a society abiding by law. God's glory is the continuity and the eternal increase. Children then are the intrinsic good. They are the ultimate good. They are God's glory. Not just existing, but in our being with them. Laws, and this is Jonathan's beautiful words, laws can be followed toward the dark and the light. However, the path toward the dark is simply the wide obverse of the narrow verse toward the light. If one is doing the opposite or fails to follow the path toward the universe, by retaining their individual order, their own path, rather than choosing to be sublimated into greater order, they will not enjoy increase. Society will not perpetuate if we do not inculcate within ourselves what we ought to value, that highest value, which is children, the intrinsic good. I hope you've noticed some of these Brian Krashisnik paintings across the way. This is one of my all-time favorites. He calls this choosing everything. When we as society choose children, we have chosen everything. And I leave that with you. Thank you.